Act 1. The Incident. He didn't just murder them, he destroyed every corner of their future. January 16, 1984. Aurora, Colorado. Snow blanketed the quiet suburb of Montview Boulevard. Children were still tucked in their beds after a long holiday break. Families returned to routine, coffee brewing, cars warming up, alarms blaring. But at one modest one-story house, nothing stirred. When police entered 1630 East Center Drive later that morning, it was as if time had frozen. The silence inside the Bennett home wasn't peace, it was horror. Blood painted the walls, soaked the carpets, and told a story more savage than even the most twisted nightmares. Bruce and Debra Bennett, both in their 20s, had been brutally beaten to death inside their own home. Their 7-year-old daughter, Melissa, was also found murdered, her body showing signs of both blunt force trauma and sexual assault. But what shattered the responding officers most wasn't just what they saw, it was what they heard. In a small bedroom, 3-year-old Melissa Bennett was still alive. Barely. Her skull was fractured, jaw shattered, and her tiny face swollen beyond recognition. She had been attacked just like the others, but somehow she survived. The doctors would later call it a miracle. Others would call it a curse. The community was shattered. Who could do this? Why? And how could they have vanished without leaving even a footprint in the snow? Act 2. Timeline of discovery. The Bennetts were a picture of the American dream. Bruce Bennett, 27, was a Navy veteran working at a family-owned furniture store. Debra, 26, was a stay-at-home mother devoted to her daughters. They had just moved into their Aurora home to start fresh, to raise their girls in a safe neighborhood filled with playgrounds and good schools. That dream ended overnight. The discovery was made by Bruce's mother, Constance Bennett. She arrived that morning after Bruce failed to show up for work. What she walked into would never leave her. "I just knew something was wrong," she would later whisper through tears. Police initially thought the scene was a robbery gone wrong. Jewelry boxes had been opened and drawers dumped, but nothing significant was missing. What was missing, though, was any clear sign of the killer. No forced entry, no fingerprints, no DNA matches. No neighbors had seen or heard anything. Aurora police launched a full-scale manhunt. Sketch artists, bloodhounds, psychics. But for every step forward, the case took 2 steps back. Dozens of tips poured in, but none led to the monster who had destroyed an entire family in a single night. Then came the next blow. Just 1 week before the Bennett murders, 2 similar attacks had occurred in nearby towns. On January 4th, in Aurora itself, Patricia Smith, a 50-year-old grandmother, was raped and beaten to death in her living room, her body left under her own family photos. 5 days later, another attack struck a family in Lakewood. A husband, wife, and child were bludgeoned, but survived. The weapon in each case, a hammer. The MO, cold, intimate, and terrifyingly personal. Suddenly, the Bennetts weren't the first, and they might not be the last. Act 3. The victims and their life. The Bennetts didn't live dangerously. They didn't owe money, use drugs, or make enemies. They were ordinary, but in some ways, that's what made it worse. Bruce was the kind of father who came home tired from work, but still helped Melissa with her reading. He was disciplined, respectful, quiet. Debra was nurturing and full of life. Friends remember her laugh as the kind that filled the room. She was fiercely protective of her girls. Melissa loved dancing, drawing, and playing with her little sister. And Vanessa, she was just starting to talk in full sentences. They weren't just victims. They were obliterated. Melissa was sexually assaulted before being murdered. Bruce had clear defensive wounds, suggesting he fought the attacker to his last breath. Debra was found in the master bedroom, killed in the same brutal fashion as her husband. And Vanessa, barely alive, a fractured skull, deep lacerations, a lifetime of pain waiting ahead. Doctors at the children's hospital worked around the clock to save her. She survived multiple brain surgeries. Her jaw had to be wired shut. She lost the use of her left arm. And even decades later, the trauma lives on, not just in her bones, but in her memories. The Bennett family didn't die in some tragic accident. They were erased by something, someone, who seemed to vanish into thin air. But monsters leave traces, and this one wasn't done yet. Act 4, Crime Scene Breakdown. It was one of the most disturbing crime scenes Aurora police had ever encountered. The word overkill was an understatement. Each member of the Bennett family had been attacked with the same object, a claw hammer. The force used was staggering. Bruce Bennett had severe head trauma and multiple defensive wounds, indicating he likely fought the killer in a desperate bid to protect his family. Splattered throughout the home, tracking a chaotic fight that likely started in the hallway and ended in the master bedroom. Debra was found with fatal blunt force trauma to the head and face. Her body showed signs of sexual assault. She had tried to protect Melissa, who was found nearby, also brutally assaulted and bludgeoned. The attack on Melissa was so violent, authorities believe she was specifically targeted. What kind of monster does this to a child? Vanessa's bedroom was the last stop. She had been sleeping in her crib. Her used the same hammer to cave in part of her skull. But for reasons still unknown, he didn't finish the job. The attacker left behind very little. No fingerprints, no usable fibers, no hairs. The only solid clue was a bloody boot print and some biological samples, including semen. But in 1984, DNA testing was in its infancy. It would be decades before that evidence meant anything. Meanwhile, 2 other crime scenes bore eerie similarities. Patricia Smith, murdered 5 days prior in Lakewood, had also been raped and beaten with a blunt object. In that case, the killer used a fireplace tool. A witness saw a man fleeing the scene, but the sketch led nowhere. In Aurora, on January 9th, another family was attacked. The mother was raped, and all 3 victims were beaten. They survived, but only barely. Whoever this was, he wasn't just a killer. He was a serial predator, and he was escalating. Act 5, Suspicion and Lies. As the investigation dragged on, police turned their attention to several possible suspects, but none fit perfectly. A man named Clayton Lee was arrested in connection with the Smith case, but he was later cleared through DNA. Several drifters and ex-cons were questioned, and some people in the area had a history of domestic violence. But there was no evidence linking them to the brutality at the Bennett home. The media dubbed the unknown suspect the Hammer Killer. Behind a city in panic, sales of locks, alarms, and weapons skyrocketed. People began sleeping with lights on. Children were no longer allowed to play outside alone. The comfort and safety that suburban Aurora once represented was shattered. Meanwhile, investigators followed every tip, hundreds of leads. They even consulted psychics. The case went cold. And then, the lies began. Someone was feeding the family hope. Multiple false confessions came in, including one man who claimed to be possessed by Satan and led police to a field full of nothing. Others were wasting resources that could have saved lives. Frustrating part? The killer was likely right under their noses, living quietly, waiting. And the blood he spilled was drying into history. CT6, the turning point. For nearly 3 decades, the case remained unsolved. The Bennett murders, along with the Smith and Lakewood attacks, were filed away as cold cases. But the evidence, carefully preserved, was not forgotten. Then in 2002, DNA testing technology finally reached a point where it could offer answers. The semen sample collected from the Smith crime scene submitted for analysis. A profile was created and uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database. But no hits came back. Disappointment followed, but the database was growing. Every year, thousands of new profiles were added from convicted felons and arrestees. It was only a matter of time. That time, in 2010, Colorado passed a law allowing familial DNA searches. This meant if the suspect's exact profile wasn't in the database, but a close relative's was, investigators could narrow down the list. In 2016, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation finally got a hit. From the Smith and Bennett crime scenes matched. Both were committed by the same man. And more importantly, it matched a family member of a man named Alexander Christopher Ewing. He had been in prison since 1985 for a with a large object in Arizona. He scrambled to test Ewing's DNA directly. The results were undeniable. It was him. Alexander Ewing, now a graying man in his 50s, was the sadistic killer they had been searching for since 1984. The same man who destroyed the Bennett family. The same man who had raped and killed Patricia Smith. The man who nearly killed a family of 3. He had slipped through the cracks for decades, and now justice was finally catching up. Act 7. Psychology and motive. Who was Alexander Ewing, and how did a man capable of such brutal, sadistic violence vanish into anonymity for over 3 decades? Born in 1960, Ewing, Hollywood-style monster. He blended in, low profile, no consistent address, drifting from state to state. He had minor run-ins with the law, but nothing that screamed future serial killer. And yet, what he left behind was carnage only the worst of humanity could justify. Psychologists later examined his crimes and concluded that Ewing was a power-driven predator. The excessive overkill, especially the hammer attacks to the face and skull, indicated not just a desire to kill, but to obliterate identity. It's a classic marker of sadistic rage. Experts believe the sexual assaults were about control, not desire. This wasn't about lust. This was about domination. He didn't know the Bennetts. He didn't know Patricia Smith. There was no vendetta, just random suburban families, chosen because they were vulnerable, because they made easy targets, and because he could. Is how quickly it stopped. After his final known attack in Arizona, Ewing was caught while on the run and imprisoned. No murders after that, no hammer attacks, no trace. The blood trail abruptly ended, not because he repented, but because the system finally locked him up. Not for the right reasons. For 35 years, he sat behind bars while families in Colorado waited for answers. Ewing never confessed, never explained, never showed remorse. And maybe that silence was the final insult. Act 8. Aftermath and emotional echo. When Ewing was finally extradited to Colorado in 2018, he was shackled, surrounded by media, and asked just one question. Did you kill those children? He said nothing, but the DNA said everything. In 2021, Ewing stood trial for the murder of the Bennett family. Debra's mother, now in her 80s, sat in court, finally able to face the man who stole her daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter. Melissa Bennett would have been 39 years old. A mother herself, maybe. A teacher, a writer, someone. Instead, her childhood was reduced to evidence tags and autopsy reports. Ewing was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He received multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Not from lack of emotion, but because no words could capture what had been lost. At the sentencing, Bruce Bennett's brother addressed the killer directly. You tried to erase our family with a hammer, but here we are, still standing. And now, you will never hurt anyone again. It was a moment of justice. Delayed, but delivered. But justice doesn't restore what's gone. The Bennett home was demolished years ago. A new family lives where that nightmare unfolded, unaware of the horror buried beneath the foundation. Patricia Smith's daughter still leaves flowers on her grave every January, and Colorado's tight-knit suburbs have never truly felt safe again. Alexander Ewing didn't just take lives, he fractured a community's belief in innocence. He was the shadow that crept in through unlocked doors, the reason mothers double-checked every window, the stranger behind every suburban smile. He was the monster in the neighborhood no one saw coming. And in the end, this wasn't just a crime, it was a warning. Sometimes evil doesn't hide in the dark. It walks in broad daylight, and it wears a human face.